In today's session, we're talking about what has become, in many ways, the defining military technology of the age, the so-called drone, or in the terms favoured by the military, the unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, or alternatively, the remotely piloted vehicle, the RPV. We'll mostly refer to the drone, but we are talking effectively about this same technology, remote controlled aerial vehicles, which have been used, particularly as concerns us today, for the purpose of targeted killing. And we will examine the technological lineage of the drone, and we'll think about the specific use it's been put to, this targeted killing, and what this practice tells us or reveals about the character of war in our time. The first recorded targeted killing, in fact, through a drone strike, goes back to 2002, at least in the context of the War on Terror, and the killing of an Al-Qaeda leader in Yemen. Since, drone strikes have been carried out across the world in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Libya, or Iraq. Indeed, we can review some of the patterns of these strikes. We can first see the usage of these strikes developing and gaining visibility in the deployment in Pakistan through a CIA operated campaign from about 2004 onwards. And as with these strikes in Pakistan and in others, very little information actually comes through official channels, and most of what we know has been through journalistic investigations and piecemeal leaks. That's partly because of the involvement of branches of intelligence services such as the CIA, or because of the more or less covert nature of some of these strikes, given that they take place outside of established theatres of war. So what we know about these strikes is often to some degree contested. In other words, the numbers, particularly when it comes to numbers of casualties, are disputed or are have some degree of doubt surrounding them. But nonetheless, we have a certain amount of information that can give us an idea of the scale of these practices. So we can see, for instance, that in Pakistan, by February 2016, about 400 strikes had been conducted, killing between 2,500 to 4,000 people, including 400 to 1,000 civilians, although these categories of civilians and combatants are inherently difficult to distinctions to make, but as we'll see. This is a usage or a campaign that began tentatively under the Bush administration, but was then significantly escalated under President Obama's administration. And we see a peak in 2010, and then a progressive winding down in the last years of the administration and beyond. And this is a reflection of not of an end of reliance on drones, quite the contrary, but rather that the landscape of drone strikes really corresponds to a very uneven and shifting geography. So, for instance, we can see when we look at drone strikes in Afghanistan that just as strikes were ramping down in 2014, 15, 16, they start to increase again in Afghanistan. In fact, on a scale that's much larger, 13,000 strikes in total, maybe up to 10,000 killed. And so as strikes petered out in Pakistan, they shifted to Afghanistan. Of course, there's a border between the Northwest Territory of Pakistan where the strikes were concentrated and Afghanistan, so quite likely the same individuals who were often crossing the border were being targeted, and the decrease of strikes in Pakistan probably had more to do with the political difficulties that the strikes were creating for the Pakistani government rather than a radical change in strategy. Outside of Central Asia, we can see Yemen as another area in which strikes have been ongoing. Here there's been a peak in 2017 where several Al-Qaeda leaders and operatives were targeted. So under the Trump administration, drone strikes were not at all abandoned, even though they were reduced quite significantly in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Similarly, Somalia has seen various waves of strikes, some of which are fairly recent. So we can see that in all these territories, drone strikes have at different times been adopted in order to conduct targeted strikes. We can also see, and these are UK numbers in this case, because drones are not the exclusive preserve of the United States. We can also see that drones have been used in Iraq and Syria as part of a wider aerial campaign. So here you have numbers that reflect both the use of the Reaper drone, which is an American drone that is in the British arsenal, and you can see that it's part of a mix of different aerial weapon systems, more conventional fighters such as the Tornado and the Typhoon, supplemented by the Reaper. And indeed, it's important to locate the drone within the wider arm of air power. In fact, drones are not really a new technology in themselves. They in fact can be traced back to the earliest days of military flight. In the First World War, the Kettering bug, a reconstruction of which can be visible on the left, was an early autonomous aircraft. Similarly, in the Vietnam War, thousands of lightning bugs were used as surveillance platforms. So drones are not new. They really have been with us, as in unmanned aircraft, have been with us in the military context since the very beginning of aviation. But throughout most of this history, they served as surveillance platforms or perhaps for target practice. And certainly as surveillance platforms, drones still play a very major role. But what has made the drone much more prominent and significant as a platform is when it became equipped with weapon capabilities, when drones effectively became hunter-killers. So we need to place drone strikes within a wider history of air power, and notably the use of bombing, with, again, a lineage that can be traced back to colonial pacification in the interwar years, where aerial bombing was used by Western countries in order to put down restless natives. We would have to think about the strategic bombing campaigns of the Second World War and the various air campaigns in Iraq or Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So drones have not appeared from nowhere in any sense, and they correspond to an iteration of 100 years or so of air power. But why drones? So why have drones become so significant in the recent couple of decades? Well, if we had to think about what is specific about UAVs, what is their singular asset, what distinguishes them, why use drones rather than other weapon platforms? Well, perhaps its most significant characteristic is persistence, which is to say that a drone aircraft can stay over a single area for very long periods. Current drone aircraft can fly for about 25 hours without returning to base, and there are further UAVs who are being developed for much, much longer periods, some potentially for weeks and months. And this is very significant, of course, because relative to a manned aircraft, which of course has to go return to base not only to refuel but so that the pilot can rest, these aircraft are able to stay over terrain for a very long period of time. They can survey a target for again, extended periods. And this has, in the words of Derek Gregory, enabled a spatial and temporal compression of the kill chain. Aircraft have been used for surveillance from the very beginning of air power. generally speaking, what would have to happen is the aircraft would spot a target, and then it would have to relay that information to another system, perhaps an artillery battery that could perhaps target it, or it had to fly back with photographs, and then the analysis of these photographs would then allow for future aerial raids. With the UAV, there is the ability within a single platform to observe a target, to follow it, and to strike with that same platform at the most opportune time. So this is a great advantage of the UAV. In addition to this, there are no risks to human pilots with drones. These are capable of being operated thousands of miles through satellite telecommunications. And for risk-averse militaries, this is a great boon. And we'll have the opportunity to discuss the consequences or implications of this further. Finally, drone aircraft are cheap, certainly relatively to manned aircraft. The average US military drone, which is itself a fairly sophisticated and expensive device, is only about 5 to 10% of the cost of an F-16 fighter jet. And that ratio would further diminish if we compared it to a late last generation fighter aircraft like the F-35. In addition, the training of fighter pilots is extremely costly as well. So when we take these factors into account, it's perhaps not surprising then that since 2009, the US Air Force has been training more drone operators than it has airplane pilots. And some have even gone so far as to suggest that the F-35 that I've just mentioned might be the last manned fighter. Certainly, it is a prohibitively expensive system. The program is estimated to cost over its lifetime nothing short of $1.5 trillion. But for now, let us turn to the implications of the policy of targeted killings implemented through drone technology, since this is what has brought drones to public consciousness primarily. And moreover, we can see through it how this exercise of targeted killing participates in a potentially radical transformation of warfare.